Hi, my name is Jolyn Hollum, and I'm here with Lucia Gutierrez and Daniela Campos. This is our response bias final for AP Statistics.
Topic and response bias. Our study focuses on academic performance comparison among high school students. The specific response bias being investigated is social comparison bias, where a participant's response to the study may be swayed when made aware of other participants' responses. In our study, a student might underreport or overreport their study habits and academic achievements when comparing themselves to their peers.
Who's our target population? St. Joseph High School students from grade levels 9th through 12th grade, with their ages ranging from 14 to 18 years old. And they're all female students with varying extracurricular activities, course rigor, and GPA averages.
So, for our experimental design, we recorded a control group without bias. So, this was 32 randomly selected students who answered questions about their study habits and academic performance privately. We asked the following questions: How many hours do you study per week? What is your current GPA? And how often do you complete homework on time?
For our experimental design with bias, 32 students were randomly selected to answer the same questions, but were told their answers will be shared with their academic advisors. The following information is shown before the questions are asked. Most successful students study 5+ hours per week. The class average GPA is a 4.0, and 75% of students complete all homework on time.
Now let's move over to our sampling methods. We will be using stratified random sampling and blocking. So for our stratified random sampling, we will take the freshman roster at St. Joseph High School and put numbers 1 through 163, which is the total amount of freshmen in this class, through a random number generator. We will randomly select 16 numbers, and those 16 numbers will correspond with each student in the class on the roster. And the first 16 students to be selected and not repeated will be used in the study. And we will repeat this for each grade level. Then the first 8 numbers to be selected will receive the set of questions without bias. And then the last 8 numbers to be selected will receive the set of questions with bias. Repeat this for each grade level. Then, for blocking, the 32 randomly selected students with bias will be separated equally into 4 blocks: freshmen with bias, sophomores with bias, juniors with bias, and seniors with bias. And each block will contain 8 students. In the blocking without bias, there are 32 randomly selected students without bias, and they will be separated equally into 4 blocks: freshmen without bias, sophomores without bias, juniors without bias, and seniors without bias, and each block will contain 8 students.
For our hypothesis, when asking students the question, how many hours a week do you study, what is your current GPA, and how often do you complete homework on time, we hypothesize that students who answer with false knowledge of the average student's academic performance in each grade level will boost the number of hours studied, GPA average, and percent average of on-time assignments. Additionally, we hypothesize that anonymous students in the control group without the social comparison triggers will answer honestly, giving a rough estimate of how many hours they actually study per week, honest GPA scores, and more accurate percentage of on-time assignments. These averages are likely to be lower than that of the experimental group. We believe that social comparison bias will greatly affect this experiment. Because many students wish to either match or exceed their peers academically, they might conform their perceived study habits and academic achievements to match a false expectation. Thus, we hypothesize that the difference between the series of questions when asked with bias and without bias will differ by about 1/3.
Data collection reflection. Experience. Our group's biggest setback was non-responses in our surveys and having to figure out how many people are in each class and clicking the emails. Besides this, our research went smoothly, and we had fun gaining actual statistical experience on how to sample without bias and come up with questions that fit our prompt of social desirability. Takeaways. For our control group in the without bias form, we wanted to ensure that recipients would be anonymous, so we opted for no emails or names reported. We later realized that we had to record emails to keep track of who responded and know who to email reminders to. Another takeaway is that we should have added a larger range of GPAs and specified if it was weighted or unweighted to get a more accurate depiction of if people were lying about their GPA or study habits.
Now on to our sample results and our takeaways. So each block from our control group, which was without bias, we had 100% responses, and our experimental group with bias, we also had 100% responses from each block. And our takeaways. Reminder was sent out 3 times to people who had not responded previously, and the constant reminders could have discouraged people to respond. All seniors and majority of juniors responded quickly, where a population lacked was with the underclassmen. For the experimental group, which was the one with bias, some people could have been hesitant to respond due to the form not being anonymous.
So this slide kind of shows a little bit more of what our forms actually looked like. So as you can see, they're very similar. They're both titled Study Habits and Academic Performance, except for the control group without bias. All we mentioned kind of in the description of the form was please answer the following survey honestly and that all responses are anonymous. In our experimental group form, however, we included those triggers, those social comparison triggers, and said that according to the DASS, and then those social comparison triggers, and then we also included that the responses and names attached to the responses would be shared with the student's academic advisor, as well as asked for the student's full name.
And here we have the graphs for both of the surveys. And our first question is, how many hours do you study per week? And the graph, we have both graphs with bias and without bias. And we chose to use pie charts to visually represent our data. And we picked this so that way we could utilize color to highlight the difference between the responses of with bias and without bias. And the pie chart also converts the responses into percentages, which makes all of them equal 100%. And when asked how many hours these students study with bias, it was a tie between 4 to 7 hours and 0 to 3 for majority, with both being 38.2%. Without bias, the majority was 4 to 7 hours, with it being 56.3%. The main difference between these two graphs is that 11% more students answered in the bias survey that they study 8 to 11 hours, which can be accredited to the opening statement of most successful students study 5+ hours per week. For both graphs, no student responded that they study more than 12+ hours.
Okay, now on to our next graphs for both surveys. And these are the graphs that answer what is your current GPA. So on the left, we have the with bias, and then on the right, we have the without bias. So we actually weren't really able to see too much of a difference between the with bias and the without bias reportings of GPA. There wasn't too much of a difference. But between the two surveys, a greater number of students responded having a 3.1 to 4.0 GPA over the students who responded to the survey without bias. However, a greater number of students reported having a 4.1 to 4.5 GPA responding to the survey without bias over the survey with bias. So it was kind of like an opposite effect that we actually thought was going to occur. And the largest difference reported was the 5.3% difference between the with bias 4.1 to 4.5 option and the without bias 4.1 to 4.5 option.
And then finally, our last question, how often do you complete homework on time? This, as you can kind of tell by the pie chart, was our biggest variance within the two surveys. So after the results from the third question were collected, we saw that a greater number of students with bias reported studying a greater number of hours than the students who responded to the survey without the bias. 13.3% difference between the with bias always option and the without bias always option, as you can see by the blue portion of the pie chart. There's a 13.1% difference between the with bias sometimes option and the without bias sometimes option, which is the yellow portion of the pie chart. And then the most times were about the same, with 37.5% on without bias and a 37.1% on with bias.
And now we have our conclusion. In conclusion, the questions we saw the greatest difference in were how many hours do you study per week and how often do you complete your homework on time. Contrary to our hypothesis, when asked what is your GPA, we saw 5.3 more students in the 4.1 to 4.5 range without bias than with bias. However, this could have been caused by our statement of responses and names attached will be shared with the student's academic advisors, making people more inclined to tell the truth than give into the social pressure of the class average GPA at St. Joseph High School is 4.0. Although there was an 18.1% greater amount from students who study 4 to 7 hours who responded to the survey without bias, there was an 11% greater number of students from the survey with bias who reported studying 8 to 11 hours. In the how often do you complete your homework on time, there was a 13.3 difference between the bias always option and the without bias always option, and the 13.1% difference between the with bias sometimes option and the without bias sometimes option.
Thank you for watching our response bias final video.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Have a great day.
Have an amazing day. Stats-filled day. There's a 100% probability that you will give us an A.
Yes.
Yay. Bye-bye.